This video came about because of having watched somewhere around 400 episodes just of Reason and Theology, and hundreds more of Catholic Answers. In this video, we are responding to the claims of Catholic apologists that there is evidence for their Roman Catholic understanding of the papacy, because that is what they put their trust in. In their view, so long as the papacy is true, they do not need to worry about anything else because Roma locuta, causa finita, or Rome has spoken, the case is closed. This is why Catholic apologists try first and foremost to prove the papacy. If they can prove that, there is really no way anyone can argue about other points of doctrine and practice, because if the audience accepts the papacy, they will have to accept the decrees of the papacy on those issues, and once the papacy decrees, the case is closed. There's no debating it.
I'm of the opinion that if somebody states something publicly, you can respond to it publicly without having to directly go to them first.
No, you don't have to go to them personally if it's public. You have every right to respond publicly, and one does not necessarily have to go to them privately because their information is already reaching people publicly. And this is all public material, so I put this out publicly. I wouldn't put out anything that's private. But as soon as you put something out publicly, you know what? You have to be willing to receive public responses.
But there is no church teaching that says magisterial documents are free from all error. So even if there were errors in papal teachings after Vatican II, that would not show those popes were not really the pope.
And if you say there was no idolatrous intent, why were people on all fours bowing down to these things? Let me see if I have a picture.
Idolatry, by definition, is the worship of something or someone other than God. And that is not what Pope Francis did. That's what nobody did. At best, you could say
no evidence that a pagan idol was worshipped in the Vatican Gardens in 2013.
Were you even paying attention?
Now, could there be some people who intended to worship a pagan idol through it? Maybe so.
Leftist apologists trying to make excuses for this. First, they said, oh, it's the Virgin Mary and it's St. Elizabeth. Both of them are pregnant. The Vatican press officer shut that down.
These were indigenous Catholics offering worship with a symbol of Mary.
It might be a horrible representation and way to represent the Virgin Mary.
take a chill pill, read the Holy Father.
But didn't he refer to her as Pachamama?
Yeah, he did later on refer to it as Pachamama, but I thought that was more accommodating language. This is the way people are referring to it.
Then they started saying, well, it's just a symbol of life.
Or this statue could just be a symbol of an abstract concept, like motherhood.
We're talking about symbols here that symbolize fertility, new life in a Christian context, not the worship of some goddess. So there's a lot more to be said on this, my brother.
Even if this was pagan worship, even if this were an idolatrous act of worship, at best he would be like Pope failed in his duties, the failure to act when you should. A pope could even be mistaken in matters of faith or morals. In a 2017 interview, Francis said, "And today Lutherans and Catholics, Protestants, all of us agree on the doctrine of justification. On this point, which is very important, Luther did not err." Here is what the Pope said to that group. "Division is the work of the father of discord, who does everything possible to keep us divided. I feel like saying something that may sound controversial or even heretical, perhaps.
Y me viene a la mente decir algo que puede ser una insensatez, o quizás una herejía. Io credo che le intenzioni di Martin Lutero non erano sbagliate e oggi luterani e cattolici, protestanti tutti, siamo d'accordo sulla dottrina della giustificazione. Su questo punto tanto importante lui non aveva sbagliato.
At that point, I'm like, that speaks for itself, you know, and you say, well, you actually would have to then, if you pulled that back, like, it's mind-boggling to imagine what would happen.
Next is the papal bull Cum Ex Apostolates, which included disciplinary decrees that were laid down to ensure no Protestant could ever become pope during the difficult period of the Counter-Reformation. However, this was a disciplinary measure that, contrary to what Diamond says, is not a matter of divine law. I also want to point out before we continue that some people are going to accuse me of Pope-splaining or sycophantically painting Pope Francis in the best light instead of facing him for who he is. But I admit in some of these cases, Pope Francis does scandalous things or he makes errors. But all this is just a poorly articulated response in an interview.
Were you even paying attention?
Unless it's just abundantly clear that you can't interpret his actions in a positive way. In some cases, I think that might be the case. In some cases, I think that we can say this was a wrong move of the Holy Father. And we have to be willing to express that. We have to be willing to say that rather than be the group that says there's no problem. You got to do what's right. You got to go based on objective truth. But then I'm trying to square what I'm seeing with the papacy with objective truth, and it's not matching up.
Yeah.
You know, what I thought the papacy was supposed to be.
A pope could even be mistaken in matters of faith or morals.
Issue that really, really, really needs to be addressed today, because so many people are under the impression that the only thing that is really being protected by the Holy Spirit is the infallibility of definitive teachings like an ex cathedra teaching or a solemn definition of an ecumenical council.
Well, that's our hope, isn't it? Because if that's not true, we're just left with this pope who says all sorts of stuff. I think that's why Catholics are like, oh, God, no, he's never done anything ex cathedra, so none of it matters.
And that's where I think, okay, this creates problems, because now we're saying that the magisterium can promulgate heresy as long as it doesn't do it definitively. I think we need to be a little bit more limited in the scope of what we're saying here whenever we're critiquing Pope Francis for what he's saying. Because, again, I don't think that it's a doctrinally defensible position to maintain that the Pope can promulgate heresy in his magisterium as long as it's not ex cathedra, even though that tends to be a very popular view these days. I don't think that that's a tenable position. I was under the impression that the main purpose of the church is really to bring souls to heaven. And I kind of felt like the Pope wasn't really focusing on spiritual issues. He was focusing on issues related to the environment and a gospel of the environment. And coming from Protestantism, I'm thinking, but where's the gospel, you know, of the forgiveness of sins and the need to repent of sins and the gravity of sin and stuff like that, and then the mercy of God. I wasn't hearing that, but I was hearing stuff about the environment. And so that was very confusing to me as well. They showed me a video of John Paul II in Assisi of 1986. And, you know, you have all kinds of people from different religions there and you know, praying to their gods, and the Pope's right there next to them. And they were saying, you see, you know, Rome is full of paganism and corruption, and this isn't the one true church. And so how do I process things like Assisi of 86 and a Pope allowing things like this, and in light of the papal claims? So very early on, again, I was struggling with how does this work?
In fact, in 1949, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith released a document on ecumenical meetings between Catholics and non-Catholics. It said in this pre-Vatican II document, in all these meetings and conferences, any communication whatsoever in worship must be avoided.
Pope Francis joined Grand Mufti Rami Yaron on Saturday in a tour of the Blue Mosque. Pope Francis stood alongside the Grand Mufti, facing the direction of Mecca, and bowed his head in long prayer. The prayer was an important public demonstration of Pope Francis's commitment to Christian-Muslim dialogue.
The Pope had allowed a pagan to touch his forehead and do something on it, having erroneous ideas about interreligious dialogue.
He arranged and actively participated in a pagan ritual that worships the, quote, Western grandmother and the, quote, sacred circle of spirits.
At worst, he engaged in scandalous behavior by being present at this event. He teaches religious indifferentism. Even if the Pope acted in scandalous ways toward other religions, that would not prove he was no longer the Pope.
And it doesn't mean that everything the Pope does is right. It doesn't mean that everything he does isn't even harmful. I mean, there could be some things that he might do that is scandalous, and that does harm people.
The declaration also said the following: pastoral activity in the Catholic Church no longer aims at proselytizing among the Orthodox, and it has no desire for expansion at the expense of the Orthodox Church. So, in other words, neither church would try to convert each other's members. This can make it very difficult to help Orthodox Christians interested in becoming Catholic. So you're completely free to say that this declaration was a very bad prudential judgment on the part of Pope St. John Paul II and other popes who made it.
It's kind of surprising that so many Catholics either don't want to talk about it or they totally want to whitewash it.
What did you find inadequate about the answers Catholic apologists were giving at the time? Because presumably you were looking into different Catholic groups to see if they could clarify the mess.
Yeah, I felt like a lot of their answers were very surface level and weren't particularly nuanced. So I found most of them to be deficient.
Okay. Did you continue to have a high regard for Catholicism? Or on paper, at least? Or did you kind of grow in some anti-Catholicism, Catholic sentiments?
Catholics, we're the worst. We are the worst.
No, well, I don't think I was ever really anti-Catholic. And in fact, here's the awkward part. Here I'm coming from Protestantism where there wasn't a lot of stability. And now I'm coming into a new situation where I felt like there was a lot of instability. So I kind of felt like, well, you know, am I just going from one situation of instability to another? You know, what makes Catholicism really different? So I just had to struggle with that. And again, a big part of confusion for me was how to process the post-conciliar reforms. Yeah, here's another point. My time in Presbyterianism, I enjoyed it. I had a great time in Presbyterianism. So here's the thing. I had a great time in Presbyterianism. I had a great time there. I had a horrible experience in Catholicism. I could always point out, but you know what? I had a great time also with the Reformed Protestants. So that doesn't really answer the question for me. That's not moving the needle.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Protestants have been a true light to this world, actually enriching the faith of Catholics.
Read all of Vatican II, among other things. And that caused me to have a lot of questions because I just felt like, well, it looks like the church has radically changed in the post-conciliar era. How does that really work? And how can this be the one true church if it's just radically changing so much? And my personal journey, because I've had to struggle with, you know, some of the issues that we're dealing with right now. I've been struggling with that since 2012. That's, you know, when I entered the Catholic Church was 2012. And I immediately began to encounter problems in the Catholic Church. And pretty soon, you know, Pope Francis was elected Pope, and so I started experiencing a lot of confusion. And I began to experience just a whole lot of theological confusion and didn't really know how to process the situation. But just continued to work through the issues, and it just seemed to get worse as the years went by. The current pontificate really threw me a loop, right? Because I came to Catholicism from Protestantism as a convert, convinced of the Catholic magisterium and the structure of the papacy, and then here I'm not seeing the papacy functioning the way I thought it was supposed to function. When you're living an experience that's very different than what you see on paper and objectively, that caused a lot of cognitive dissonance. And so I just said, look, Catholicism makes sense to me on paper, but the experience has been dreadful.
And was that particularly the papal claims and the understanding of the magisterium? Is that what kind of...
That was the deal breaker for me, was the papacy.
Yeah.
But then here I am, a Catholic, and I felt like the papacy is doing everything it can to destroy the church. So the very thing that I said is the deal breaker between Catholicism and Orthodoxy is the thing that I'm starting to see is actively going against, I felt at least, the church.
Yeah, I mean, that's it exactly, right? And so a defense of the papacy that doesn't account for the history is a poor defense. And you know, like I said in the book, it sets you up for disappointment. There have been plenty of people who they have an idealized version of the papacy. They have an idealized version of what unity is going to look like in the church. They come in, they get promptly ignored once they're no longer in RCIA. They get the cold shoulder. They hear heretical homilies. You know, bad things don't get corrected at the diocesan level. And they get really disillusioned and they walk right back out the door they came in. And that's a problem. And I can't solve all of the problems that I just mentioned there.
Back to the nature of evidence, you might say. You have to encounter the evidence honestly for yourself. You just have to follow the truth no matter what, and the evidence is you understand it no matter what. I think this is really true, and I think this is true because of X, Y, and Z. And I think that even though that guy's really wise, I just don't see why that's true or how that's true. And I've just got to be honest with what I see now. And that matters. Even if you're wrong, it matters. Are you willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads you? Because that's the right attitude. And I think he was right. So I think we have to just be honest with what we have in front of us now, what we think at all levels.
It would be contrary to the truth if, proceeding from some particular cases, one were to conclude that the church's magisterium can be habitually mistaken in its prudential judgments.
But what happens when you have 100 things that the Pope has said that are being done this way?
That you can freely reject and say it's a bad prudential judgment. But sedevacantists have a good point when they say, if you feel that you can disobey the Pope's teachings whenever you want, then in what sense is he even the Pope for you?
Were you even paying attention?
The present Pope we have, I wouldn't trust him with any question I sent him. Okay?
Did you hear that? And he's not a sedevacantist. He's not a sedevacantist, guys. He's not. Let's hear that part one more time.
Okay?
And he's laughing. And he laughs too. Here, let me do that one more time. Listen to this. Okay, here, listen.
The present Pope we have, I wouldn't trust him with any question I sent him. Okay?
There you go. All right.
Let's think about this. How can we as Catholics follow the teaching of this man and get to heaven? It's a hard question. Would I allow them to be catechized by Francis? No way.
It's possible for the vicar of Christ to be an unbeliever. Possible, yeah. So that's an interesting view.
And I felt like this is the straw that broke the camel's back. It came on the heels of already a whole lot of loss of confidence in the papacy theoretically.
What did you find inadequate about the answers Catholic apologists were giving at the time? Because presumably you were looking into different Catholic groups to see if they could clarify the mess.
Yeah, I felt like a lot of their answers were very surface level and weren't particularly nuanced. So I found most of them to be deficient.
Okay.
Within the first few weeks, he was saying things that I felt were imprudent. And it did not seem like he was coming back and correcting them.
Yeah.
And that might be a criticism that I think we could still offer. If we say something that's imprudent, it might be helpful to come back and correct it and clarify what we mean. I think that there were instances where Pope Francis wasn't being clear, or at least that's the way I perceived him. Again, I'm not weighing in on what he actually said, but just my perception of it at the time was that this was wrong. And how could a Pope say such things like this? So I started to see things like that really concerned me. Francis is still alive, so he can clarify. I've also responded to that and said, look, in some cases he doesn't. And we might ask the question like, well, why doesn't he come back and like clarify? Okay. I think it's because he is abundantly clear on what it is. There's no need to clarify, but you might still say, but it's still necessary to come out and say something. I understand that. But at some point when this is happening to you daily, you're going to get tired of having to clarify yourself when you were already clear enough. You're going to get sick of it. So I wasn't very impressed with the responses that I was hearing at the time. And it wasn't really addressing the question that I had. How is it that the papacy is supposed to be here to guard and preserve the deposit of faith as a divine institution? And it sure seems like it's doing everything except that. It sure seems like it's doing the exact opposite. It's trying to destroy the faith. I got to the point that I just said, doesn't that prove that Catholicism is really it's invalidated itself?
How do you deal with the spotlight on you where people maybe look to you as some sort of authority figure?
Yeah,
and perhaps you've said things that were unhelpful, and how do you deal with the negative consequences that you may have unintentionally effected?
It's caused me to be a little bit more careful in the words that I use. I'm not saying that I've always been successful and currently being successful with that, but I've had to try to be a little bit more guarded and mitigated in my delivery and what I say. Why are you in communion with a pope who worships demons? What does that say about you? Why are you in communion with a demon worshiping pope? I was looking through social media earlier today and I saw Eric Ibarra was having a discussion with somebody and he asked them the same question. This has been a question that I know I've asked and he's, I think, also been asking for several years now. If what you're saying is true, you're saying you're in communion with a demon worshiping Pope? How does that work out for you? Why are you in communion with him? Let's consider this from sacred scripture. I mean, we could talk about being in communion with people in the first millennium, and if you're in communion with a heretic, that makes you guilty also of their sin to an extent, and that puts your own status into question. And so we could have that conversation in the first millennium, but let's actually just go to straight to sacred scripture. Here's what it says. Do not be dismayed, or mismated with unbelievers.
But to escape the end times counterchurch and recognize the true church during this apostasy, people need to care more about the dogmas of faith than about externals and buildings, and seek to please God rather than men.
So at that point, I just said, look, maybe it makes sense on paper, but this might just be God showing me, hey, maybe it makes sense to you, but it really doesn't. Maybe you don't have all the answers on how this works. Maybe I don't have all the answers, but I just feel like Catholicism isn't that answer because of the way it's functioning. It just seems like the papacy is invalidating itself. That he was just basically giving up the dogma in practice. You know, he wasn't denying the dogma theoretically, but in practice, he was just making it moot. And I just thought, look, I thought the purpose of the papacy is to guard and preserve the deposit of faith. But here you have a pope who's acting contrary to that which has been handed down to us from Christ himself. Doesn't this defeat the whole purpose of the papacy? I mean, why do we even have a papacy at this point if the papacy can be such an active force in destruction in the church?
Nuanced theology.
And I do oftentimes remind my Catholic brothers and sisters when they get so frustrated and when they want to say things like, oh, I don't understand why these Protestants can't think this or can't believe that. It's just plain to see. I will often remind them, well, it's a little bit different than what you might think. You have to remember some of your Catholic biases have been built into you from the way you've been raised. And someone who hasn't been raised in that environment doesn't bring that to the table. Right. And it's healthy to recognize what things are baked into your worldview subconsciously and what things you chose to import there, and then distinguish those so that you can get to the heart of a real conversation.
Why don't they buy our arguments? And so there's an answer to that question. There are reasons that our Protestant friends give in the face of these Catholic arguments. And it's not that they're just being stubborn or closed-minded or irrational. They actually have, on the surface, good reasons to give in response to the Catholic argument. Reasons as to why they do not accept the Catholic reading of these texts. Give these Protestants their voice, articulate and explain and lay out what these reasons are for not accepting the Catholic interpretation of these texts, and then engage with them. Catholics can sort of get a renewed respect, that it would generate a certain respect for our Protestant brothers and sisters so that we can protect ourselves from becoming anti-Protestant, because we don't like our Protestant friends being anti-Catholic, right? And creating straw men, knocking down straw men objections, etc. So we would need to protect ourselves from becoming anti-Protestant. And I think by going through the literature, seeing what Protestants say in response to our Catholic arguments can promote that. And I think that can lead to a healthy discussion and a charitable discussion that we can have with our Protestant brothers and sisters.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I think that is a really good point.
Because you can watch many of the different Catholic commentators who have and will be reviewing this debate, who, when they respond to this issue, they're like, yeah, all that stuff is heretical. But even then, the conclusion doesn't follow.
If they deny the faith, they're no better than the Jansenists in Epistua, which denied the faith. You don't have to attempt to define these things on the level of infallibility. This is kind of a new test. And if we applied that, only the Pope would become heretic by trying to infallibly define falsehood as truth. And that's ridiculous. That would rule out Luther as a heretic.
You could not conclude that a pope was a manifest heretic unless he was found guilty of the canonical crime of heresy. By confessing himself to be a heretic, some people are going to make Catholics look bad. Should I shut the comments off? No, I'm not going to do that.
If we can show Jesus creates this sort of triangular structure of the church where one man's at the top, well, that gives us an indication that that is at least the normative model. So the burden of proof should be on the Protestant.
So it seems to me that as the church is expanding, its principal point is not to become a political structure that can be universally recognized as a top-down hierarchy. No.
And so there's like major problems there. And unless you're going to arbitrarily just choose one side in that fight, there should be some principle by which you can know, well, what is the true church that I'm supposed to be a part of?
There are times, my friend, when you come to an impasse in a discussion where there's no more you can do. If one is willing to doubt the fundamental principle of reason, of the principle of non-contradiction, well, they're undermining their very reasoning capacities itself.
It's kind of surprising that so many Catholics either don't want to talk about it or they totally want to whitewash it.
And nobody's asking the tough questions at Vatican press conferences about how could you have appointed people who are undermining Catholic teaching.
He approves pro-LGBT activists such as James Martin.
Bad hiring decisions and promotions only show you're a mediocre manager.
Which is why, as you said earlier, Christ is the foundation. It's not the papacy.
Yeah.
It's got to be Christ.
Right.
Because I'm sometimes afraid that Protestants are tuning into us, being like, okay, what is happening?
It's possible to be a Catholic, but not be saved. It's possible to even be proud about being a Catholic and not be saved. It's possible to even be going to Mass and not be saved. It's possible to be proud about being a Catholic, not be saved.
We're in a final confrontation between the gospel and the anti-gospel, between the church and the anti-church, between Christ and the anti-church. Like, there's really a different gospel going on right now in the Catholic Church. There's really a different church, which is a church of accommodation.
If papal infallibility is true, then why did it take 1,800 years?
We have to recognize that in the scope of like
distinguish and sub-distinguish.
In the scope of history, how dogma has been declared is you have the question first brought up, and then you have a ton of reflection on it. And in this case, it was brought up around 9th, 10th century among some of the canonists, early medieval canonists, and it was thought and debated for centuries and centuries and centuries. And the dogma doesn't get declared until there is after a certain point of reflection, a certain universal agreement and surety about it. And that surety took a while to reach.
You know what it is. You know, we shall destroy the program. Destroy the program.
I think the silence speaks for itself.